Hello, everyone. I'm so excited to be joined today by Milo Wolf. Milo is a PhD student at Solent University in the UK. He is one of the brightest young students that Dr. Fisher and Dr. Steele have. And then obviously great friends with Dr. Pack as well. So we're so excited to have you on today, Milo. Why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit of your background.
Yeah, so thank you for the warm introduction. As you said, my name is Milo Wolf. I have been into exercise science for a few years now. I did my undergrad at Loughborough University in sports science and then have started my PhD at Solent University, looking at the effects of range of motion during resistance training on hypertrophy and strength. The reason I got into a PhD was because I was quite passionate about sports science and lifting weights in general and muscle hypertrophy. And the reason I looked at range of motion, or I've been looking at range of motion, and I'm actually due to graduate within the next few months at some point, once I submit my thesis, is because I have been coaching for a while now, and I've competed in bodybuilding and powerlifting, and I used to be kind of working for a company called Renaissance Periodization, and one of the things that they used to claim a lot at the time was that full range of motion was best for hypertrophy. And back when I was applying for a PhD, one of the things that had recently come out was a systematic review about the effects of range of motion during resistance training on muscle hypertrophy. And just to briefly define what range of motion is, range of motion refers to how much movement do you go through during a given exercise while lifting, right? So when you're squatting, for example, you have the choice between going all the way down into an ass to grass position versus, for example, going half the way down into a half squat or a shallow squat. And the extent to which you move during the exercise may influence how much muscle growth you get from it, or how much strength you gain from it, or a variety of other outcomes that might be of benefit or of interest to a variety of trainees.
Yeah, and range of motion is something our listeners will certainly be familiar with, and something we preach as well. Obviously, for a long time, the literature and just the general idea was that training through as large of a range of motion as possible is probably the most beneficial for not only hypertrophy and strength outcomes, but also just for flexibility, which is something I definitely want to talk to you about as we get sort of into this nitty-gritty of the back and forth between full versus partial range of motion. I didn't realize that you had a background with Renaissance periodization, though. That'll be interesting, especially when you go over to Lehman, because I think Mike's over there. So that should be nice to see them again. And hopefully you guys have a nice relationship going back and forth there. But let's just go a little into the history of this idea of full versus partial range of motion. So if we look at the long time recommendations, again, it's been to train through as full of a range of motion as possible. Our listeners will be very familiar with Nautilus machines, MedX machines. They were specifically built and designed with the idea of providing variable resistance throughout that full range of motion. So what is sort of the background in your mind, your experience with both full and partial range of motion?
Yeah, so I think there are kind of three relevant time points here. The first time point is kind of what I coin pre-direct evidence and pre-sort of literature existing. I think within bodybuilding culture and sort of general exercise culture, there's always been some ideas surrounding range of motion and what's best and what's potentially more injurious, etc. So generally, as you said, like a variety of people have had ideas about what range of motion is best. For example, with you mentioning Nautilus, designing equipment to go through a pretty full range of motion and that being best. There's also been beliefs in sort of popular gym culture that on squats, for example, it's dangerous or risky to go past your knees going over your toes or that sort of stuff. So there's always been some commonly held ideas floating around range of motion, even before much direct evidence had come out about range of motion and how that might influence adaptations like muscle growth. So that's kind of the first time point of interest, I think. The second time point of interest kind of coincides with right before or right as I was applying for my PhD. And that's when the first systematic review came out on the effects of range of motion on muscle hypertrophy. And that was back in 2020 by, as you mentioned, actually, Brad Schoenfeld and Jozo Grgic. At the time, there were only 6 studies out there on range of motion and muscle growth. And there were 4 studies in the lower body and 2 studies in the upper body. So in these studies, people were assigned to either a full range of motion group, where people trained through as much range of motion as possible, essentially, or a long range of motion at the very least. And the other group trained with a partial range of motion, which typically is about, on average, around half the full range of motion. So a lot of the time, if they use the squat, that might be a squat to below parallel, which is kind of like a full range of motion by their definition, versus a squat to maybe like a half squat, and not quite parallel, substantially above parallel in some cases, and comparing the adaptations, such as hypertrophy, between the two groups before to after the study. At the time when this systematic review was conducted in 2020, the authors essentially concluded that in the lower body, the evidence was very consistent in showing that a full range of motion was better than a partial range of motion for hypertrophy, whereas in the upper body, because there were only 2 studies, A, there was kind of a lack of data overall, and B, the studies were a bit conflicting in that one study had found a non-significant benefit to a full range of motion, whereas the other study had found a benefit to partial range of motion for hypertrophy. And so in the upper body, things were a bit less clear, and this kind of led to them hypothesizing that maybe there is a muscle-specific effect, such that the lower body muscles respond differently to the upper body muscles, and different muscles might respond differently to range of motion, and that might mediate the relationship between range of motion and muscle growth. So that's kind of the second time point of relevance, I think, to me, in part because that's the last thing I read about range of motion before applying for my PhD. And so it kind of felt relevant in that and crucial in that sense and pivotal. But also because since then, there's been quite a few new studies that have come out.
So before we dive into those, Milo, actually, I think it's worth taking a pause here and kind of pointing out some of these things, because you went over so much interesting stuff there. That pre-direct evidence, I love the way you stated that. And I think it's important to note that this is the way most people get their evidence, right? This is essentially the bro at the gym who's telling you what to do. And that's sort of how lore and coaching and all these things kind of become dogmatic within the strength and conditioning community. So I love that verbiage and really just, worked for me. You should do what I did, because obviously look at how big my biceps are, right? And then going into this first systematic review, and maybe you'll touch on this too, but it sounded like, at least from what you were describing with the squats, partial versus full, were they mostly looking at multi-joint movements when comparing partial range of motion versus full range? And I'd love to hear, as I'm sure you'll get into a little bit, is there a difference potentially that we'll find out between maybe single joint movements at partial or full muscle length? So please continue. I just wanted to point out a couple things there.
Yeah, so definitely with regards to the lower body, the squat is kind of a favorite in sports science, where people just love to look at the squat. It's applicable to some sports. It's an exercise often performed in the gym for hypertrophy and strength. It's part of sports like powerlifting, and so it's quite a favorite in terms of the research. So yes, it's mostly been compound exercises, at least at that time. That was mostly what had been investigated. As you mentioned, prior to direct evidence, there were sort of commonly held beliefs based on what appeared to work to people, or what the jacked people were doing oftentimes. Then some direct evidence came out that was reviewed in 2020 by Schoenfeld. And at the time, it did look like full range of motion was on the whole better. There was more evidence in the lower body, less so in the upper body, but it did seem to be the case. Now, I started my PhD. I started looking at these studies in a bit more detail. More studies started coming out, which eventually led to me performing my own systematic review and meta-analysis on range of motion. This came out, I want to say, about 2 months ago now. I had pre-printed it a long time ago, so it was published ahead of print, but it's been published in an academic journal and peer-reviewed 2 months ago. And that paper had aimed to kind of systematically look at the evidence now, as opposed to 3 years ago. The interesting thing with range of motion is that it's kind of undergone a renaissance phase where there's been so many new studies recently that I think the conclusions nowadays that you can draw from literature are quite distinct from what they were a few years ago.
So maybe we can talk about, it seems like that's where you were heading with this, but maybe talking about some of the differences and the conclusions that have been drawn, and maybe a little bit about the research that's actually been in that review, which was published, like Milo said, just very recently. It's called Partial versus Full Range of Motion Resistance Training, a Systemic Review and Meta-Analysis, and that will be linked in the show description as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So broadly speaking, what our meta-analysis and systematic review found is that when you group outcomes by type, for example, sport type outcomes like jumping and sprinting, versus power type outcomes like rate of force development, versus muscle growth outcomes, like how much of a muscle thickness increase was there in their biceps or in the quads or what have you. When you group outcomes that way, a full range of motion approach did appear to outperform a partial range of motion approach, but only by a very small impact. So the effect sizes were generally between 0 and 0.2, which for anyone who's versed in statistical literacy, it doesn't mean a whole lot. It's a small difference, a very small difference. So that's kind of what you see when you zoom out and take a look at the big picture, right? So if someone came to me, for example, and said, hey, I want to get adaptations in a variety of ways. I want to get better at sports. I want to grow some muscle. I want to get stronger. If that's all I know about a person, a full range of motion approach is a pretty reasonable recommendation, right? And a full range of motion is essentially the largest range of motion you can use based on your flexibility, your mobility, and so forth. Now, to me, the more interesting parts of this meta-analysis were twofold. One was related to hypertrophy, and one was related to performance outcomes. I'll cover performance outcomes first because it's a bit simpler and more straightforward. When you grouped performance outcomes by being less specific or more specific, what you generally saw was that training a certain range of motion improved performance in that range of motion more than training a different range of motion. For example, if you wanted to get better at the powerlifting squat to just depth, right? In that case, most of your training to maximize improvements in that exercise should be performed with that range of motion. Not necessarily more range of motion and not necessarily less. It does seem like range of motion adaptations are specific, which means that whatever range of motion you train in, that's the range of motion you'll get the biggest improvements in. So if, for example, you're a sprinter or you compete in powerlifting where the range of motion demands of your sport may be different, generally you want to stick mostly to the range of motion of your sport, and that's what will have you see the greatest improvements in your performance.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting. And I think something worth noting as well when it comes to the specifics of exercise, because one of the things we talk about all the time on the podcast and that we really try to drive home to our listeners is that, there's this idea that there's this cross training effect, that things are very, they have the ability to be sports specific just based on generalized training. And that to me is just another driver home to just reinforce this idea that no, what we're doing is very, very specific, right? And the motor neuron patterns that we create, whether we're strength training or whether we're playing soccer or football, if you're across the pond, or American football, or whatever the thing is, if you want to be good at it, you have to practice it specifically. And that to me, I think is so important to really drive home. Now, again, when we're talking about general adaptations, maybe it doesn't matter. Full range, partial range, as I'm sure we'll talk about, kind of whatever you prefer. But if you're going to squat heavy, you should probably squat heavy in the range of motion that you're going to be performing when you're actually competing. That was great. I just really wanted to highlight that.
Well, absolutely. Training definitely does need to be specific. You can make improvements by being general, especially when you're relatively untrained. But the more trained you become, the more specific your training will likely need to be to maximize improvements or even to see meaningful improvements. The second interesting finding to me from the systematic review and meta-analysis that we performed was regarding hypertrophy or muscle growth. So as I discussed earlier, when you group outcomes very broadly or from a very sort of big picture approach into full range of motion versus partial range of motion, looking at hypertrophy, we did see that full range of motion on average outperformed a partial range of motion by a sort of trivial effect size, by a very small amount. However, it's important to note that not all ranges of motion are created equal. So the way that range of motion may influence muscle hypertrophy, for example, is in part through which muscle length is being trained. So if, for example, you're performing a partial rep in the fully lengthened or fully stressed position, like think about the bottom of a squat, where your quadriceps and your hip extensors, like your glutes, might be more lengthened, versus doing a shallow squat, like the top of a squat, where your quadriceps and your glutes, etc., are actually quite shortened. Depending on what muscle length, the same range of motion, the same, for example, 50 degrees are performed, that may actually influence how much muscle growth you see quite heavily. So when we subdivided a partial range of motion into being performed at either shorter average lengths or average longer muscle lengths than a full range of motion, a different sort of picture emerged, right? So when partial repetitions were performed at shorter muscle lengths, we did see that full range of motion outperformed partial range of motion by quite a bit for hypertrophy. The effect size actually grew. Whereas when a partial range of motion was being performed at longer muscle lengths in a more stressed position, like for example, doing just the bottom of a bench press versus doing the full rep, in that case, actually, doing a partial range of motion seemed to potentially outperform a full range of motion for muscle hypertrophy. So it seems as though the impact of range of motion on muscle hypertrophy is very much muscle length mediated, such that training at lower muscle lengths seems to be good for hypertrophy. And in fact, because it's good for hypertrophy, performing partial repetitions at longer average muscle lengths than a full range of motion would allow you to may actually be better for hypertrophy than doing a full range of motion.
So I'd love to go into mechanisms for this, but I think before that, it's important to maybe paint this picture a little bit more for our listeners who may be lost a little bit on just talking about different muscle lengths. I think a perfect example for this would be a bicep curl, right? So most of our clients or listeners, anybody who's listening to the podcast has probably done a bicep curl at some point. So let's imagine you're doing the bottom half in this case, I would assume, for that long muscle length position, right? That 90-degree position. So from the extended position up to 90, elbows bent perpendicular to the floor, you're working in that range of motion. Or for a leg extension, instead of extending all the way up, right? We're doing that same thing, that bottom stretched position to about halfway up. Trying to think of other good examples here, and I'm spacing a leg curl from the stretch right up halfway again. So really the worst part of the range of motion, right? Essentially, and now obviously that's debatable. But I think again, it's important to differentiate, because when we go back to, like you said, the pre-direct evidence piece, a lot of what you would hear in the bodybuilding community, a lot of what I heard when I first got into resistance training is, oh, you had to strength train in the strongest range of motion towards the end, right? If you wanted to maximize hypertrophy, maximize strength building benefits, you should do some reps at the end in a bicep curl in the opposite end, right? In that fully contracted position, which obviously, as Milo's kind of talked about here, appears to be nonsense, right? Is actually significantly worse from a hypertrophy and strength perspective. So now that we've got that clearer picture, let's talk a little bit about the why. Why could it be that training in those positions, which are typically, for most at least, single joint isolated exercises, the weaker positions, and a lot of times, or at least feel weaker, right, from a mechanical perspective as you're moving through that range of motion? Why might those be more beneficial for strength and hypertrophy? What did the literature kind of show you in that review?
Yeah. So one thing I want to make clear real quick is that they're not necessarily better for strength. They're likely better for hypertrophy, but for strength, again, performance and strength as well are specific to the range of motion being trained, right?
Thanks for clarifying that. Yep.
All good. For hypertrophy, it's definitely not super clear yet. We don't have all the answers. I think there are a variety of candidate mechanisms that could be at play. The two most likely ones that we think are at play for now are the following. The first one is, if you actually look at regional hypertrophy, so not just at the hypertrophy of the whole muscle, right? Like when you look at the hypertrophy of the biceps, for example, you could just say, well, the biceps is just one big muscle. Let's look at the hypertrophy of the whole muscle altogether. Let's not try and compartmentalize it. But you can also look at hypertrophy regionally. Like, for example, the biceps when it's closer to the shoulder or where it's closer to the elbow. And we kind of term those from more proximal to more distal sites. More proximal is closer to the origin point of a muscle. More distal is closer to the insertion point of a muscle. When you look at hypertrophy more regionally or via compartments, essentially, what you see is that longer muscle length training appears to promote similar hypertrophy at more proximal sites, but greater hypertrophy at more distal sites. So for the biceps, for example, it seems to promote similar hypertrophy closer to the shoulder, but greater hypertrophy closer to the elbow compared to shorter muscle length training, like, for example, doing the top of a bicep curl, right? So doing the bottom of a bicep curl seems to grow the biceps more closer to the elbow than doing the top of a bicep curl, which is kind of intuitive in a way, because that's kind of where you feel it a little bit as well. So it may be that longer muscle length training just activates certain parts of your muscle more that shorter muscle length training doesn't, and thus then eventually leads to more growth in those areas, which then, if you look at it from a whole muscle perspective, you see that overall, because it grows them more in the more distal area, and to a similar extent in the more proximal area, it does also grow them more overall, right? That's one candidate mechanism. Another one is a bit more complicated, and it's to do with the signaling proteins in your muscle. So this is a bit more molecular in nature, so I won't go too far into the the depths here, but essentially it looks like the proteins involved in signaling for hypertrophy to happen when you're training, right? Like when you're training, you expose your muscles to tension, certain proteins get activated, and that eventually leads to hypertrophy. Certain of these proteins that are involved in signaling for muscle hypertrophy or muscle growth to happen may not just be tension related or dependent. So it's not just, oh, you apply tension to a muscle or you make it contract and it will grow the muscle. It may also be muscle length dependent. So certain proteins may activate hypertrophy more essentially when tension is being produced at certain muscle lengths. So it's not just you can contract your muscle at any length and that will make your muscle grow. It may be that, yes, you can grow muscle contracting at any length, but you grow more muscle when contracting at longer lengths because certain of these proteins are more sensitive to it, essentially. Those are kind of the two, I would say, leading candidate mechanisms. There are other ones that are related, for example, blood lactate or to passive tension or what have you, but I think those are a bit less likely to be the culprits or the mechanisms at play.
Yeah, and obviously, until we do more research in this area, it's possible too that it could be multiple confounding factors, right, that are leading to this. But that seems to make intuitive sense too, just on the idea of, obviously, if you want to contract through a full range of motion, and even if you can't, you always have to start at the long muscle length, right? So that's going to be the area, regardless, that's going to have the most tension, regardless of what kind of move or exercise or movement pattern that you're participating in. So it would make sense that movement might be dictated, and the adaptations that happen from there might be dictated by, hey, we're starting to move. Let's start sending those signals for adaptation. That's super interesting, man. So let's try to kind of wrap people's heads around how they can apply this, right? Because we maybe have a few high-end athletes that are listening to the podcast, but for the most part, it's people who just want to optimize health. So how can people start thinking about applying, if they even want to, long muscle length partial training into their workout routine? This is something I talked with your colleague, your professor, Dr. James Fisher, about how to start utilizing with clients when we were at our last conference together. And I'd love sort of your thoughts as a bodybuilder, as a power lifter, maybe how you've implemented it, as a coach, how you're maybe implementing it with some clients of your own. And then the other big thing I'd love you to maybe talk about a little is if there's any research on if we're implementing this, could it maybe be negative compared to full range of motion training when it comes to flexibility benefits, which are obviously extremely important for your average person who want to optimize functionality overall. So I'd love for you to take us away on that route.
Absolutely. So I think you can kind of divide use cases here into a few categories. You can divide it into one category, which is mostly for people who want a variety of adaptations, right? Who want to grow some muscle, who want to get stronger, who want kind of quote unquote functional strength. And the reason I say quote unquote is because ultimately, if you gain muscle and get stronger, that'll carry over to a variety of everyday tasks, and you don't need to be super strong to get by in everyday life. But there is such a thing. If your goals are relatively general, you're not concerned with optimizing muscle hypertrophy. You're just concerned with looking good, feeling good, performing pretty well. If that's the case, a full range of motion can actually work pretty well. It will provide you with a variety of benefits. It will make you stronger in a variety of positions. It will make you better in a variety of positions. Whereas using a partial range of motion may predominantly make you better in that partial range of motion, right? Which if now, let's say in a sport or in everyday life, you get exposed to a position that's not that position, you may not be quite as well performing as if you perform the full range of motion, right? So if you're just looking for a variety of adaptations, being a pretty well-rounded athlete, person, individual, what have you, it can be a pretty good approach. Now, if you're someone who's looking to optimize hypertrophy, or even just get an easy edge in hypertrophy over someone else or over another approach, long muscle length partials can be pretty helpful. The way I'd implement them is dependent on to what extent you're willing to change your training as well. Like for some people, there is a enjoyment or preference component to it, where they just enjoy training with a large range of motion because it makes them feel better or what have you, and that's fine. But if you're willing to experiment, I think the easiest or least drastic way to experiment with it would be, for example, to incorporate pauses in the fully lengthened position. So for example, at the bottom of a squat, instead of just coming right back up, you could pause briefly in that position before coming back up to essentially spend more of your set or spend more time in that fully lengthened position that's likely quite productive for hypertrophy. You can also do things like select exercises that are difficult in a lengthened position, right? So you know certain exercises that are easier or more challenging in the lengthened position. Like when you think of a pull down or a pull up, for example, when you're in dead hang position, there's not a whole lot of tension going on, right? It's not the most difficult part of the exercise by any means. However, when you're performing, for example, a pullover, especially with a dumbbell or with barbells, oftentimes you will feel a deep stretch in your back that is one of the hardest part of the lift, right? So in that case, taking a pullover over a pull down is selecting an exercise that's more difficult in the lengthened position, and that might be better for hypertrophy as well. So those are a variety of ways you could apply it. Another way you could apply it would be with something I call a lengthened superset, which is essentially when you take a full range of motion set to failure or close to failure, and then without rest, you continue the set. So let's say you're doing rows, for example, you continue doing reps, but this time just doing about half reps in that lengthened position. So from the fully stressed position to halfway up. This can be beneficial and it can be a fun way to train in some ways as well. And it's another way of applying this concept. The final way of applying this concept, and I think the most drastic, but also the most direct way of applying it, is to actually straight up perform partial repetitions at long muscle lengths. So in the research, what we've actually done is compare long muscle length partial repetitions to full range of motion. So if you want to replicate the results of these studies, the most direct and foolproof way to do so is to actually perform long muscle length partial repetitions. And in practice, this will generally look like doing somewhere around half reps. So it could be between like 1/3 and maybe 2/3 of your full range of motion in that stretch position. As long as you're somewhere in that ballpark, in my estimation, you're doing pretty well based on the research we have. And you would do exactly the same thing as for full range of motion set. So if you usually train to failure, that's fine. If you do 10 reps usually, you can do 10 reps. The only change really is that you're doing a partial range of motion in a lengthened position. I would say those are the two camps, broadly speaking, I would divide people into. So if someone, for example, is predominantly focused on hypertrophy, but still has some general goals, you can kind of adopt a hybrid approach, right? Where they do some of their training as lengthened partials only, and some of their training with a full range of motion. So that way, they get the extra edge, or at least some of the extra edge with hypertrophy from those lengthened partials, but they also get a wider variety of performance adaptations from that full range of motion. You asked earlier about flexibility as well.
Before we go into that, Milo, because you're just on a roll, man. You're crushing so many points here. I love it. First off, I think that's great from a recommendation perspective. I think there's so many things there that our listeners can use and implement in their own training. It also makes me feel a lot better because I was having this conversation with Dr. Fisher when I saw him recently about how to implement, and I was doing exactly what you mentioned there with the lengthened supersets. So as a trainer, as a practitioner, the idea of having my clients come in and telling them, hey, we're going to do some half range of motion reps today through their full workout, they probably look at me like I'm a lunatic because they're just not as tied into what's actually going on. So knowing that we can implement things like that, strategies, I've kind of been using it as an advanced overload technique, right? Instead of doing, assisted reps, let's do some partials in that lengthened position. And that was actually spurred by this review paper that you did. So I'm glad to know I've been implementing it correctly. Hearing from you now, I think just the idea of doing a full workout, and I've actually tried this too, at least on a few different exercises in my own routines, of just doing all partials on each exercise. It feels weird. And again, maybe the hypertrophy results are going to be superior. But for me, even after all these years of training, it's like maybe I'd want a little more muscle growth, but I don't know if I can do bottom half of the range of motion leg extensions and squats for the rest of my life. So it's definitely interesting to implement, though. And I think something else that we can use in our toolkit to keep people interested, to potentially push them to maybe want to try a little harder, do something different, get that different stimulus that a lot of people are chasing, of just, oh, this feels different, this feels novel, and maybe that will keep them interested in the long term. But now let's talk a little bit about flexibility, because I'd love to hear what the research so far has to say, if anything, on that.
Yeah, so the research isn't super clear yet. The one thing we know, not for sure, but quite confidently now, is that lifting weights does appear to promote adaptations and flexibility. So there's a recent meta-analysis and review paper comparing the effects of resistance training or lifting weights on flexibility or range of motion compared to stretching, static stretching. And it does seem like actually lifting weights, contrary to the popular belief of lifting weights makes you stiff and makes you less flexible and you can't reach around anymore and you're muscle bound. It actually does the opposite. It seems to promote flexibility and mobility improvements to a similar extent as static stretching does. And so that's interesting, right? Because that means that we can actually lift and see improvements in flexibility over time. The thing with range of motion that I come back to is I'm not convinced, or there's no direct evidence at least, saying that a full range of motion necessarily enhances flexibility more than a partial range of motion. The caveat there is that partials at long muscle lengths are not that different from static stretching in a way. In static stretching, you're exposing your muscles to tension at their longest possible muscle lengths. When you're doing partial repetitions at long muscle lengths, you're essentially doing the same. And when we speak about range of motion, typically, for most people, we're talking about improving range of motion at those longer muscle lengths. So whether you're performing a full range of motion repetitions or longer muscle length partial repetitions, I suspect both of them would improve your range of motion similarly. I think that if your range of motion is restricted sort of at lockout or close to shorter muscle lengths, in that case, doing a full range of motion may enhance it more. But for most people, I think partials at long muscle lengths will likely enhance your flexibility to a similar extent as a full range of motion. But we don't have any direct evidence on this yet. That's just my hunch based on sort of a mechanistic rationale, what I've seen happen in practice as well.
Yeah, and it again makes intuitive sense, right? If we're talking about stretching your quadriceps, the closest thing we have to that is that bottom position of a leg extension, right, where your legs are stretched all the way back. You're feeling the tension there. So it again intuitively makes sense. I couldn't agree more. It'd be interesting to see. It's probably going to be a little while before we get some kind of review on that sense, as we're just starting to really get into a lot of interesting literature on these long partial range of motion papers anyway. So really, really interesting takeaways, Milo. I'm really excited to start implementing this, have some of our listeners start implementing these sort of things, see, how their experience is, what they've liked, what they've disliked, and starting to incorporate stuff like this in their own workouts. Any other interesting things in this field, this emerging area of research that we should know that you think are worth sharing, or any other maybe key takeaways that you think people could start incorporating on their own to maybe dip their toes into the long muscle length water? I'd love to hear any sort of closing thoughts on those ideas.
Yeah, so there's a couple things I'd say. One is regarding strength. We do have some evidence where instead of just comparing a full range of motion to a partial range of motion, they compare using, for example, a full range of motion and a partial range of motion to just a full range of motion and looking at strength. And it looks like overall, when you look at using a variety of ranges of motion together, like a combination essentially, so you do some of your training with a full range of motion and some of it with a partial range of motion, you see that strength improvements are similar or better actually using a variety of ranges of motion compared to just using a full range of motion, for example, or just a partial range of motion. So for strength athletes, for example, people who want to get stronger specifically, there may be utility to, for example, doing some partial range of motion training alongside your typical range of motion training or whatever range of motion you compete with if you're performing for strength in strength events. That's one thing I wanted to mention, and it's an interesting prospect. There's not a ton of evidence on it yet, but the studies that we do have seem to be leaning that way. The second thing I wanted to mention is earlier you said that you've experimented with doing lengthened partial only training, like only sessions. I've actually been doing this for about 4 months now. Exclusively lengthened partials for all my training, except for the past week or two, actually, but for like 3.5 months, 4 months.
Practicing what he preaches, ladies and gentlemen.
I've been trying, and yes, at first, for the first couple of weeks, I think sort of the acute feedback that you get from sessions can be a bit different. So I found it difficult initially, for example, to feel a pump in my biceps, right? How relevant or how important that is, I'm not super sure, but it does take a bit of getting used to, and I can see how that would put some people off. But ultimately, I think at this point, to be honest, for hypertrophy, the evidence is compelling enough to make the case that if all you're concerned with is optimizing hypertrophy and you don't have a strong preference either way, and you're willing to give it a shot, lengthened partials, potentially only training is a good idea.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think just anything you can do to incorporate something into your training that's going to keep you interested, that's going to keep you active, right? People like you, people like me, a lot of our listeners are lifelong exercisers, right? We've made that decision. This is something we're going to do regardless. And having a little novelty and variety is great. But I think for your average person that maybe doesn't enjoy resistance training that much, to have more tools in your tool belt to say, hey, this could potentially give you the sun's out, guns out kind of look you're going for this summer, or however else you want to word it for people, so they can have that new stimulus, that new thing to look forward to. Hey, let's switch it up here a little bit, but know that it's going to be evidence based, and there is a lot of literature coming out to support this. So again, I think just something great in the tool belt to have, maybe stimulate a little bit of new growth if you've been stuck, if you've been plateauing. How have you noticed physically? Have you been taking different metrics yourself in this N of one experiment? Are you planning on maybe publishing, getting another PhD just on your own case study?
I wish it was that easy. So I haven't been taking any measurements, and that's because I don't really view it as an experiment. I think at this point, you don't call training with a full range of motion an experiment. You just do it because it's what you think the evidence suggests is best. So likewise, I don't really view it as an experiment. That being said, with my own physique and my own sort of perception, at least, I think certain body parts have seen a bit more growth than usual. I'm not going to oversell it because it's N equals one. There's a lot of confounders involved, and that's why we have science, because an N equals one experience over 4 months in an advanced lifter with a lot of confounders isn't really going to tell you anything. It can tell you some stuff about what barriers people might encounter practically. Like, for example, I don't know, for my pull down training, for example, I found it difficult to have enough weight on the stack to do lengthened partials, right? But in terms of my results, I think certain body parts have grown a bit more than usual, specifically my back, for example, which makes some sense because most traditional back exercises are relatively easy in the lengthened position. And so switching to a lengthened partials approach, at least for some of your training, may specifically improve growth in that area. But I'd say otherwise, there hasn't been anything crazy happening. I think my full range of motion strength has probably stayed the same or slightly improved. My partial range of motion strength has also improved, definitely. So I think that's been my general experience with lengthened partials.
That's great. So what else do we hope to learn in this area of research? Again, before we let you go, are you personally looking forward to actually finding out, besides maybe the actual mechanisms and other things that our listeners can maybe look forward to in the coming years? And then maybe any other projects if you want to share before we let you go as well.
Yep. So there's a couple things I want to see in the range of motion literature in the next few years. One is, broadly speaking, just more studies comparing lengthened partials to full range of motion. Thus far, we have 4 comparing lengthened partials to full range of motion. Out of those 4, 3 supported lengthened partials for growth. 1 found no difference. So it is very consistent. It's also very consistent in other bodies of evidence. For example, comparing partial repetitions at shorter versus longer muscle lengths, or isometric contractions where a muscle is kept at a constant length, but at different muscle lengths. It's a very consistent finding. So I'd say one thing I'd like to see more of is full range of motion versus lengthened partials. Another thing I'd like to see more of is there has been, as I mentioned earlier, even in earlier systematic reviews, this hypothesizing about how different muscles might respond differently. I'm relatively skeptical of that claim, but I think it is something that warrants further research. It's possible. I just don't think it's likely. And I think it would be nice to be able to refute that or be like, yep, it's not a thing, or it is a thing. And then finally, as you mentioned, once we have that sort of evidence and even more confidence in these findings, I think the next thing would be to start looking at some mechanistic stuff to hopefully understand a little bit better, and to start refining our understanding of, okay, well, we know that lengthened partials are good for hypertrophy, but what's the better approach? Is it 1/3 of the full range of motion? Is it 2/3? Do isometrics at long muscle length suffice, or do you actually need to go through dynamic movement? That sort of stuff. I think that's where further research come in handy down the line. That's predominantly what I'd be interested in seeing. With regards to my own research, I'm currently conducting 2 studies, one in the calves, where each participant has 2 calves. One calf is being trained with full range of motion, and one calf is being trained with partial range of motion. We're measuring hypertrophy and strength before and after, and we're trying to equate for muscle length being trained between the 2 calves, so that if range of motion mostly influences hypertrophy, for example, through manipulating muscle length, if we equate for muscle length between legs, is there still an effect? Does range of motion itself influence muscle hypertrophy? That's the question we're trying to answer there. And the second study we're running is looking at the upper body muscles. We're having trained lifters, people who've been training for at least 3 years, lifting weights for at least 3 years, perform upper body training 3 days a week in the gym, and measuring muscle size and strength before and after. And half the people are being assigned to a full range of motion group, where they're doing all of their training with a full range of motion, and half the people are being assigned to a lengthened partials group, where they're performing only the stretched half of the range of motion. And looking at hypertrophy before and after, looking at it also regionally to see whether there's any differences. And yeah, hopefully that should be, the calf study should be out within the next few months, hopefully. And the upper body study will take longer because we're collaborating with 5 different universities to get a big sample size to be able to tell what's going on, because otherwise with trained, advanced trainees and over 8 weeks, you can't necessarily see any huge changes. And so we need a big sample size to be able to tell whether anything is happening now.
That's super exciting because obviously we, like you mentioned there, and we've discussed multiple times on this podcast, it's hard in the exercise science space to really find enough power within the studies through participants. How many people are we talking about for this study?
Yep. So for the upper body study, we're aiming for 50 to 100 people or more over
Awesome.
1 or 2 years. We're taking our time. We've got 5 universities involved. We're running it over a year or two, just so we can make sure we get enough people in.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Milo, thank you so much for joining us today. By the time this comes out, you might be Dr. Wolf, so we'll update everything if we need to appropriately. And thank you everyone for listening. As always, we'll share Milo's contact information for his Instagram. If you want to follow him, he's a great follow. I'd highly recommend it. And good luck with all your studies. Good luck with your research. We appreciate you taking the time today, sir.
Thank you for having me.
Of course.